Welcome. If everybody can be seated, I'd like to welcome you to the keynote session of the Mormonism and the Internet Conference. I'm Galen Henderson. I'm a professor here in the English department at UVU and a member of the Religious Studies Committee. And in that capacity, I would like to welcome you today. We're happy to see you here. And I would also like to introduce our well-known keynote speaker that we're so delighted to have. Joanna Brooks is a national voice on Mormon life and politics and an award-winning scholar of religion and American culture. She covers Mormonism, faith, and politics for religiousdispatches.org and has been named one of 50 politicos to watch by Politico.com. She attended Brigham Young University and received her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles. Her first book, American Lazarus, Religion and the Rise of African American and Native American Literatures, Oxford University Press, 2003, was awarded the Modern Language Association William Sanders Scarborough Prize. Brooks has received awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and the American Philosophical Society for her scholarship on religion and American culture. I last night was reading some of her blogs, reviewing some of those. I was very interested in a recent one in January, Time for Mormons to Come to Terms with Church History. She's a provocative voice. We're so delighted to welcome her here to Utah Valley University. Dr. Brooks.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and whoever hooted when I was walking up here, that was really nice too. Life is so weird. Okay, good. And thank you too to Boyd for pulling this all together. It's really exciting to be in this room with people who I spend so much quality time online, and now I get to see you in one room, which is really a delight. And thanks to Tyler Allred and everyone else who helped make the arrangements for today. It's much appreciated. Speaking of people who I spend a lot of time with online and rarely get to see in person, but when I do, it's a joy. I was sitting down with Jana Reese last night, and we were talking about what a fascinating last few years it's been for all of us who have been learning to do this internet thing, this very steep learning curve we've experienced. And we've all been learning. Even the addresses this morning, which I loved, every one of them, we've all been learning. We're still learning what is happening with Mormonism on the internet. What I've learned in the last few years has been about the power of digital media, its spaciousness, its immediacy, its intimacy, its reach, the way it shapes the origination and circulation of ideas. I've witnessed, like probably you have, with great appreciation, the incredible Web 2.0 driven rebranding of Mormonism through the church's I'm a Mormon or Mormon.org campaign, and I've admired effective web-based crowdsourcing through the Vineyard website. I've witnessed how internet anonymity has allowed Mormons to articulate and connect around ideas and issues that we don't always get to talk about on Sunday. I think Jim talked about this, or Patrick, all of us are talking about. We can talk about things with each other online that don't always come up, depending on your ward and gospel doctrine. And as someone trained in archival and library research and brick and mortar publishing and the glacial pace of peer review, I've adjusted to the speed of the internet and the rhythms of digital story cycles. And thanks to digital media, which has allowed media to locate independent voices like mine and Scott Gordon's and Jana's and Christine Hagelin's, I've had this strange opportunity to talk to people in different places all around the world, in New Zealand and Brazil, and the equally exotic locale of AM morning talk radio in Houston, Texas, and speak groundbreaking truths about Mormonism, like the fact that Mormons are actually human beings, and that like regular human beings, we don't all think alike. And also, like regular human beings, we sometimes have complicated feelings about thorny parts of our history. And finally, here's one of those shocking, obvious things you get to say on the radio. Some of us are even Democrats. I'm looking at you, Boyd Peterson. But my experience of saying obvious things in public, and I think that's probably a nice informal subtitle to my talk, the challenges of Mormon studies in the digital era, AKA why it's hard to say obvious things in public sometimes. My experience of saying obvious things in public has taught me a great deal about the challenges we Mormons face in conveying the complexity of our faith and the historical movements it's inspired. We face challenges from without, we face challenges from within. Digital media is reshaping those challenges in dramatic ways, and Mormon Stories, I think, has a major contribution to make in addressing them, and that's the focus of my talk today. So first, to review some of the challenges well known to us all. The simple youth of Mormonism. We're still a young religious tradition. The proximity of our mythic past, our determined self-removal from the American mainstream in the 19th century, our distinctive teachings and doctrines, and the literalism with which they are held by many LDS people, all of these contribute to a public sense of Mormonism as exotic and unfamiliar. Political battles between Mormon theocracy and American nationalism in the late 19th century also constructed Mormons as treasonous, licentious, secretive, duplicitous, and murderous. Let me give you a little dose of your 19th century imagery here. We all see if we can get this to stop fixing itself. Okay. So here are some of your, yeah, it's not gonna let me do that. Okay. So here's some of your typical 19th century political cartoon images of, women entrapped in polygamy. And in the other one, the black chick in the nest is Utah. And that's like a vulture chick seeking to nurse from the United States. And for a little more of your classic anti-Mormon imagery from 19th century, this is the Mormon with horns, which is, it's a anti-Jewish stereotype. But actually, when my grandmother moved from Salt Lake to Los Angeles in the 1930s, streetcar drivers who found out where she was from would reach out and grab her head to feel for her horns. And then this is the very famous image from the early 20th century, from 1904, from Puck magazine during the Reed-Smoot senatorial hearings, where you can see this image of that Senator Smoot being held like a puppet by the hand of the Mormon hierarchy. It's an image I'll come back to. If one reviews images of Mormons in American visual and popular culture, everything from political cartoons to newspaper illustrations to greeting cards from the late 19th and early 20th century, it's difficult to escape the conclusion, as Terrell Givens has convincingly argued, that Mormons were constructed in the American imagination as dangerously alien. Outmigration from the Mormon culture region and media exposure in the middle and late decades of the 20th century generated a new set of images of Mormons as clean-cut, patriotic, conservative, congenial, disciplined, industrious, and family-oriented. Think, for example, of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir's national breakthrough 1962 appearance at Mount Rushmore. The very same year, the Osmond brothers began their television career appearing on the Andy Williams Show. The Osmond strategy, as we might call it, offered a parallel strand of imaginings to stand alongside those older Mormon images of Mormon treason, perversity, alienation, and duplicity. But this is important, without critically engaging, addressing, or revising those older anti-Mormon images. So, the question becomes in the public mind, Mormons are both of these things, right? The old images of Mormon duplicity and secrecy never get really critically addressed. And yet there's this whole new set of images that are generated and publicized alongside of them. So still in the public mind, we have this doubleness about Mormons, right? The doubleness that goes back and confirms the old stereotype of Mormons as duplicitous. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll talk about it some more. So The double imaging here contributes to a seemingly irreconcilable double-stranded perceptions of Mormons, the overtly safe, friendly, wholesome, and familiar, alongside and maybe even cloaking the dark, secretive, and alien, thus compounding old perceptions of secrecy and duplicity. Certainly, this narrative of Mormon duplicity has followed Mitt Romney on the campaign trail in the persistent refrain that Mitt lacks a personal core or that he's somehow dishonest about his true identity. You know, and we all look at him and we're like, he's a stake president. That's who he is. It's pretty obvious to all of us. But this sense that he's like hiding something, this is an old image. This is an old image, and one that kind of ironically our own attempt to put forward a very clean-cut image of ourselves has compounded. These are a few of the challenges we face from without, but other challenges derive from within. More multi-generational Mormons living in the Mormon culture region especially remain an insular community, one that is most comfortable talking about religion amongst ourselves. Outsider ridicule contributes to the reticence of LDS people, rightfully so, as does a definite sense of boundaries around the discussion of temple-related practices. But a distinctive set of communication challenges also derives specifically from how Mormons negotiated the pivotal years of the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the transition from theocratic holdouts to United States citizens, transformations chronicled by Kathleen Flake and Ethan Jorgensen. In the late 19th century, the federal government, under pressure from American Protestant groups, criminalized and instrumentalized polygamy to deprive Mormons of the rights of citizens. Out of this open conflict between Mormons and American host society developed a Mormon underground offering physical protection to men and women resisting prosecution for polygamy or unlawful cohabitation. In addition to this physical underground, Mormons also developed strategies for a kind of discursive undergrounding as another way to maintain theocratic sovereignty in the face of federal colonization. Anthropologist Damon Smith has analyzed Mormon language ideologies forged during the polygamy crisis, and from his big fat dissertation, I found and called 5 characteristics of a complex of Mormon discursive habits that we might call undergrounding. And these are, I don't want to overstate how prevalent these are, but perhaps you'll find some of these familiar. First, maintenance of a strong theocratic reserve around sensitive, theological, physical, historical, and epistemological domains. So at the height of the polygamy crisis, challenges to LDS theocracy were sometimes narrated as an assault on the temple itself. Temples have consequently come to stand as a physical emblem of LDS sovereignty, which is sort of self-determination, having our own domain of power. And we find across history, down to the Proposition 8 campaign, challenges to LDS theocracy narrated as an assault on the temple itself. LDS people also maintain a kind of theocratic reserve by demarcating some elements of belief and practice as being sort of impervious or beyond interrogation or engagement. A second characteristic, I think, of a discursive practice of undergrounding is a preference for information through authorized channels and general distrust of non-institutional sources on Mormonism. You know, during the polygamy crisis, to protect the continuing practice of polygamy and index reliable allies in this project, LDS church institutional channels of information were understood as trustworthy, and all others were coded as untrustworthy and potentially anti-Mormon. And we see that sort of tendency continue today, you know, especially in the digital landscape as things get so complicated. You know, strong trust for hierarchically delivered institutional sources of information and a strong distrust of any other source of information. It's a habit that we've adopted over time. Third, adoption of a defensive default posture of non-transparency in public communications. So in the 19th century, LDS communities dealt with the physical infiltration by federal agents seeking to root out polygamous people, including spotters and spies. And the phrase, "mind your own business," was known as the Mormon Creed. Adherence to this creed through scrupulous non-revelation of one's own private matters and refusal to inquire into the family status of others indicated in that time reliability and status. So you learn to sort of mind your business, don't say too much, don't ask too much, mind your business. It was a carefully cultivated discursive habit. Number 4, the cultivation of insider and outsider narratives. The public abolition of the LDS practice of polygamy in 1890 did not lead to the expulsion of polygamy from Mormon theology, scriptures, or belief. Indeed, a belief in polygamy as an eternal principle continued and continues as a mark of orthodoxy and sometimes status in LDS communities. The maintenance of distinctive LDS beliefs and practices like polygamy depended on the continuation of a robustly insular Mormon community, protected first by geography, geographical isolation, then by patterns of elective social affiliation, and finally by the consignment of guarded doctrines to private mind rather than public practice. Polygamy remains one of several aspects of Mormon belief and practice where narratives we allow ourselves to say in public diverge from understandings we hold within the community. And then number 5, careful public speech to protect private knowledge, and this goes along with it. The underground instituted among LDS people an understanding of public speech as a tool to sort of carefully deflect or redirect public attention to protect private belief and knowledge. And this kind of stands in contrast to what scholars of language talk about as the dominant language ideology, the dominant theory of how language should be used in the 20th century modern world, which is this idea of communicative reason, right? So when you speak, you say to communicate something in the sort of universally coded rational way. Coming out of the polygamy crisis, speech was understood as a way to sort of protect the community, to say not too much, to invite more scrutiny, to say just enough to be responsible, but kind of ward off prying eyes who did not have the interests of the community at heart. And that tendency, I think, still stays with us. From the late 19th century, an ethos privileging a degree of opacity, institutional loyalty, hierarchy, and guardedness developed as Mormon communities attempted to preserve our difference, even as we were assimilated into the broader US society. This ethos continues to some extent to this day. It shapes the way we interact with the public. It has fueled dominant culture imaginings of Mormons as deviant, untrustworthy, and duplicitous, stereotypes that crystallized in popular culture during the Smoot hearings. And it shaped the way that Mormons conceive of and sometimes experience ourselves. Scholars like Boyd Peterson have described a Mormon, quote, divided sense of self and related habits of double coding in public speech. We all joke, amongst ourselves. We can talk a certain language, and people who don't know us, we speak a different way. Just as we have our own vocabulary, our own discourse. This is especially the case in situations where LDS people perceive a threat to their way of being. A measure of cautious dividedness even operates in contemporary Mormon studies, where one finds scholars writing for two audiences at the same time, tacking sometimes back and forth, sentence to sentence, between now I'm going to write to a faithful audience and now I'm going to write to a skeptical one. So we're always playing this sort of sensitive game of, insider and outsider. Now, the digital era poses some real challenges to these long-standing discursive habits. And again, these are just, ideas I'm trying to generate, and I look forward to a good discussion. Theocratic management of sensitive materials has been a Mormon custom, but the ethos of the digital era is open source, right? Information wants to be free. So there's a pressure there. We're used to sort of protecting certain kinds of information, holding them closely, and that's not the ethos that drives the internet. A second challenge is that, whereas correlated and authorized channels of Mormon content have been privileged, Google searches now create pathways to billions of unauthorized words and images. I love what Artis said this morning. If you're not teaching your kids about, Mormon history, who will? There are billions of words and images now available online through Google search that do not come to us through authorized institutional channels about our own history. Third, whereas maintenance of a theocratic reserve and a careful management of public speech to deflect attention from sensitive aspects of Mormonism has been a Mormon custom, meme-driven feedback loops. A meme is sort of, it's like a glyph. It's like a picture idea, right? So when a picture idea consolidates in the brain, it drives more and more attention to itself. It's repeated virally. So in the internet, we have these meme-driven feedback loops that highlight and recuperate attention to sensitive spots in Mormonism. So, Mormon memes, I'll talk about in a minute, but, for example, think about the way baptisms for the dead has become a meme, right? It's entered public consciousness as this issue. Mormons baptize dead people. What does that mean? So we like to sort of manage and provide information, but the fact that this idea takes off virally just keeps driving information to itself. And then another issue, whereas traditional Mormon messaging has been vertical and hierarchical, digital networks work very horizontally. So information gets passed this way rather than this way. And finally, As Mormon content that produced by the church and by everyday Mormons becomes more broadly distributed via Web 2.0 modalities, it is also networked into and increasingly measured against common expectations of transparency, reliability, and reciprocity. Networking erodes the isolation that allows us to maintain insider and outsider narratives. And now, just by way of storytelling, I want to share with you 3 recent instances where it felt to me that digital technologies were shifting the terrain of Mormon discourse in some pretty interesting ways. Number 1, October 2010. It's the Sunday morning session of General Conference, and I'm sitting in the conference center with several members of my family. Elder Boyd K. Packer delivers a talk on homosexuality that includes some rather stirring statements about sexual orientation. All afternoon, as I'm enjoying some post-conference time with my family, I'm wrestling with myself inside about whether to write about it or not for the internet. After all, it's Elder Packer who has long offered a strong perspective on homosexuality. Was this really news? About 7 p.m. that evening, I'm sitting on the floor of the Salt Lake Airport, stealing a bit of internet before my flight, when I see reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack's account of the Packer talk go up at the Salt Lake Tribune. I email her. "Oh, shoot," I say. "You've written about it, so now I have to too." In the pre-digital era, no one much cared what Mormons gathering in Salt Lake City said about gay people. And the published transcript of that talk would not have been available to members for months. But Stack's article was immediately picked up not only by wire services, but also by LDS and LGBT digital social networking channels. Because it connected with a well-established Mormon anti-gay meme, as it were, national LGBT advocacy groups were able to extend their full-swing campaign against schoolyard anti-LGBT bullying to accuse Elder Packer, in their words, of using a bully pulpit against gay young people. Within 2 days, on October 8, the church issued an official text and online video of Elder Packer's talk with changes closely tracked again via digital media by Mormons and others worldwide. And the Human Rights Campaign used the Mormon elder's word to mobilize more than 150,000 protest signatures on an online petition, which the president of the Human Rights Campaign delivered to an LDS church spokesperson on October 13, eliciting a formal denunciation by the church through its spokespeople of anti-LGBT bullying. Come a long way from when the conference report sort of came out in the Ensign, and we read it and we moved on. Number 2, it's February 2012. For almost a century, LDS people have been quietly but systematically conducting proxy baptisms and other ordinances for deceased individuals, ancestors and otherwise, with little notice. Transitioning genealogical research and name submissions processes to the internet and the development of digital extraction mechanisms in the late 20th and early 21st century facilitates a speed up in research and ordinance work. By the same means, it also opens the entire process to watchdogs who electronically data mine ordinance records to monitor baptisms of Holocaust victims and other sensitive names. In early 2012, watchdogs identified the names of well-known Jews, including Anne Frank and the Holocaust victim parents of Simon Wiesenthal and the reporter Daniel Pearl, Jews viewed by their communities as martyrs, as having been through the process of proxy baptism. News of the proxy ordinances spreads like wildfire across digital media, from prestigious national daily papers to lowly individual Twitter feeds. The Mormon Jewish baptism meme solidifies, becoming the subject of editorial page commentaries, television comedy, and gossip. Digital crowdsourcing of name submissions and ordinance work makes it difficult to enforce policy against baptizing Holocaust victim celebrities, and yet the church must respond, which it does in a letter to all congregations and a reconfiguration of data access privileges which blocks any database user who seeks the name of Holocaust victims. Number 3, it's February 28, 2012. A reporter for a leading national daily is researching a story on the status of African Americans in Mormonism and how our tradition's historic racism may have impacted Mitt Romney. He visits the office of a popular BYU religion professor who offers a number of pop theological narratives espousing a providential view of the priesthood ban. Within hours of the story appearing online, it goes nationwide, sparking embarrassment and outcry. Early the next morning, the dean of religion from BYU meets with a high-ranking church official in Salt Lake City, and a statement is released discrediting views on race once taught from Mormon pulpits. It is the first ever official renunciation not only of the ban, but of various rationale developed and maintained by Mormons in support of it. Narratives about the mark of Cain and the war in heaven that continue to circulate among older members of our communities. In all three of these instances, we see the web, digital technologies, eroding the ability to manage public narratives about Mormonism and to insulate or protect thorny aspects or controversial aspects of our history and practice from public scrutiny. The anti-narrative logic of the internet meme, that virally circulating image or glyph that encapsulates complexes of information, including criticism and discomfort, drives attention to hotspots in Mormon experience. And in all three instances, we see how internet-driven dynamics have driven institutional responses from the LDS Church characterized by immediacy and reflexivity. What value can Mormon studies bring to challenging moments like these? Of course, it goes without saying, it always needs to be said that none of us speak for the church. That would be like practitioners of Jewish studies claiming to speak for the chief rabbinate of Israel, and I don't know any who do. But we can model as scholars, as people who write about Mormonism, a model of engagement with Mormon tradition that normalizes conflict, humanizes Mormon experience, and fosters a responsible relationship to the facts of history. We can push ourselves and others beyond those familiar discursive habits of insider and outsider that only confirm our alienation, beyond the tactics of management and suppression that confirm old stereotypes of Mormon duplicity, punish alert and sensitive members of the tradition, and empower irresponsibility. Now, thankfully, we are not without role models in this endeavor. When the story about the professor at BYU broke, the Mormon blog By Common Consent, in cooperation with Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, reran Lester Bush's vital 1973 essay on the history of the priesthood ban. And I want to just note here how this is such an exciting field because that matters to Mormon people. I don't know of any other academic fields in which there's this really close communication between here's an academic journal article, write on a blog, read it. That most fields are not that interested, don't have that kind of public interest. They really don't. It was Bush who, through exhaustive research and disciplined prose, first made the case on paper that the priesthood ban did not begin with Joseph Smith, that it was the product of a highly human process of accretion over 5 distinct historical phases. His essay was and is the antidote to a purposely unconscientious popular theological narratives that circulate and continue to circulate in LDS communities. I gave that article a little push in a blog entry at Religion Dispatches, which I've come to find out my very conservative Republican LDS mother, who still loves me, faithfully reads, and she read the Lester Bush essay for the first time. Then she shared it with my father. And 2 weeks after the the Professor Bott issue, I had with my parents, wonderful people from whom I as a child learned those narratives of Cain, Ham, and the fence sitters and the war in heaven, for the first time, an entirely different conversation about race in the church. They praised the article and said, why, yes, this makes sense. This is the only narrative that makes sense. And there it was, long tensions, blind spots healed at our dinner table and in our community because of Lester Bush. How many of you have read that essay by Lester Bush? How influential was that essay on Margaret Young, on Darius Gray, on other African-American Mormons and their allies? Its influence can't be overstated, and the great thing is it's right online at BCC. And yet it's important to recall what courage and vision that essay took in its time. Bush was just 30 years old when the essay was published. He wasn't a professional scholar. He was a medical doctor. He was stationed in developing nations. He was working entirely outside professional reward structures we now count on. Dialogue, too, was in a very vulnerable economic and cultural position, due in some parts to the fear of non-institutionally authorized sources of content. Bush was personally discouraged by Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith from using church historians' office materials. When he submitted the article to church leaders prior to its publication, a general authority told him in writing that, quote, when a member of the church sets himself against doctrines preached by the prophet Joseph Smith, he is moving into a very dangerous position for himself personally. In 2 days of one-on-one interviews with Elder Boyd K. Packer, Elder Packer personally pressured Bush to delay publication or just put the article away in the church archives, lest it become a tool of enemies of the church. See an example here of sort of this default posture of non-transparency, this fear that anything we say about our history will be used against us. See also insider-outsider narratives. If outsiders know, we're in trouble. Dialogue editorial board members also faced severe pressure. Eugene England was warned that Bush's article would physically endanger the general authorities, as it was then widely feared in LDS communities that Black militants were plotting violence against Mormon targets. A BYU vice president told Dialogue editor Robert Reese that publication of the article would get BYU, quote, in big trouble for allowing its research materials to be used, that there would be, quote, no sympathy for anyone involved in its publication, and that its publication would permanently impact the careers of everyone who touched it, that it might cause the church to, quote, lose tax exemption for all of the temples where only whites can attend. See again, the meme of the temple as an emblem of embattled LDS sovereignty. And that, quote, it would be a foot in the door and lead in the opening of church books to public examination. See again, the fear of transparency. He also warned Reese that the, quote, brethren would not be pleased with him personally and claimed to have this on good word from an unmistakable source higher up. He warned Reese that publishing the article would cost him his membership in the church. That's a quote. Even those who were invited to write responses to Lester Bush's essay were threatened by their stake presidents with disfellowshipping, and some withdrew. But dialogue persisted. After the publication, I'll skip that one. A decade later, Apostle Marky Peterson personally called Bush's stake president, J. Willard Marriott, and expressed strong disapproval of Bush's essay and instructed Marriott to call him in for a possible court. A decade later. Anyone who writes about sensitive subjects in Mormonism has experienced some measure of what Lester Bush experienced. Still today, we cannot help but be struck by the depth of the fear directed at him. This fear is an outgrowth of that complex of habits I've tried to describe as undergrounding. And what Bush did worked against these deeply ingrained habits. He did not insulate or promote non-transparency. Instead, he used basic tools of scholarship, historians' tools, to reach into one of the most difficult and contradictory aspects of Mormon history and experience. He stated something obvious in public, that the priesthood ban was the product of an accretion of human prejudices and rationales. Bush understood how important that was, and Robert Reese to this day considers publishing that article the most important thing he did as a dialogue editor. Lester Bush modeled what contemporary scholars call a critical approach to knowledge. I want to stress critical not as in fault finding, but critical as in a mode of genealogical or archaeological analysis that carefully sifts through evidence to document human complexity. The philosopher Michel Foucault mapped out this approach to knowledge in a 1971 essay where he wrote that a tradition, a history, a heritage is not, quote, a possession that grows and solidifies. It is an unstable assemblage of faults, fissures, and heterogeneous layers that threaten the fragile inheritor from within and underneath. Foucault's observations have contributed to a massive shift in my home field, the field of American studies, over the past 30 years, a move away from new presentations of grand narratives about American experience as exceptional and towards an approach that addresses the tensions, frictions, and fractures in American life. So too, as the digital era obsolesces late 19th century discursive strategies of crisis management and brings Mormons face to face with our own constituting tensions, frictions, and fractures, we need work that speaks to their influence on Mormon experience. What kind of work? Let me pitch a few dream projects. Sociologists are charting rising rates of disaffiliation among younger Mormons and high rates of non-identification with Mormonism among former converts in Mexico and Central America. What are the social, historical, economic, political, and theological factors fueling disaffiliation? What does it mean to identify as a Mormon? And what leads individuals to disclaim Mormon identity? How has Mormon identity been constituted? And how does identity constitution vary by race, economic class, gender, region? Is Mormonism perceived as a sacramental rather than an identity-bound faith in non-North American regions of the globe? Family and community dynamics and cultural practices of shaming and shunning also need rigorous examination. To many Mormons, it's common sense that one must dissociate with loved ones who leave orthodoxy. What are the theological, historical, and sociological bases of this practice? On these and so many other questions, we need qualitative ethnographic work that gathers insight and documents experience and knowledge from multiple perspectives, regardless of rank. Mormonism from below. Work is desperately needed that captures the experience and perspectives of people of color, indigenous people, and the global South. Qualitative and ethnographic research is needed on the lives of gay Mormons to assess how they manage and negotiate the incredible tensions that center around their most defining relationships. This research needs to account for differential experience of queer Mormons of color, just as work about Mormons of color needs to account for the perspectives of indigenous women and women of color, who may soon be the statistical majority in the global church. Work is also needed in the assessment of the accumulated theory and practice in LDS tradition about how we manage controversies like polygamy. A marker of the continuing power of polygamy in Mormon life is that so many of us, when we speak to the public, continue to sort of underground or insulate its persistence in our scripture and in our theology. We have yet to see a full and candid assessment of the image of polygamy on contemporary Mormon society and culture. And yet I suspect that polygamy is to Mormon experience as slavery is to American experience, defining, materially and ideologically constitutive, contradictory to some of our stated ideals, and lasting in its cultural consequences. How Mormons all around the globe in all generations manage this persistent shaping tension is worthy of attention and study. There are so many tensions and joys that constitute the rich, intellectually robust, fascinating, and often profoundly misunderstood human story that is Mormonism. And Mormonism, by which I mean to indicate the entire Mormon movement, the whole archive experiences that all of us who have identified as Mormon over the past 180 years have built, is indeed an assemblage of faults, fissures, and heterogeneous layers. It's not a solid whole. There are points in Mormon experience where pressure builds, pressure that has real effect on Mormon lives. The digital era creates conditions that amplify those pressures. It is into those pressure-filled spaces where our proudest predecessors in Mormon studies have worked with grace, judgment, and oftentimes in the face of significant fear because they have been breaking the rules of undergrounding. And doing this work means breaking some of those deeply embedded discursive rules Mormons have felt are essential to our safety and survival. The strong cultural preference for institutionally managed, highly controlled, deflective, non-transparent, protective, insider-outsider communications. These habits are the residuals of a 19th century crisis. But just as in the 20th century, the geographical isolation of Mormon people was destroyed by the railroad, the automobile, and economic outmigration, the 21st century and the digital era are destroying our informational and narrative isolation. Attentive Mormons are encountered more and more frequently with evidences of contradictions and tensions within our historic movement, and the world is watching to see how we respond, to see if we regard our own tradition with the level of rigorous consideration and conscientious reflexivity all religions deserve and ethically demand. Bob Rees, Lester Bush, Eugene England, and other heroes of Mormon studies refused the rules of the underground in favor of the rules of quality scholarship, rigor, clarity, acknowledgement of multiplicity, and they did so out of love and respect for the tradition. As conditions of knowledge in the digital age continue to surface faults, fissures, and pressure points in our own experience, there is work to do, and if we do not do it ourselves, others will do it with far less care and understanding. It took 4 decades for the work of Lester Bush to filter into the Mormon mainstream. What can we do now that will matter 4 decades from now? How can we produce work that will be a resource to our people as we continue to cross the uneven, fault-ridden grounds that have always and in every faith tradition been the terrain of the conversation between humankind and God? These are the challenges that face Mormon studies in the digital era. Thank you. Boyd, what do we do now? Yes.
Okay, regardless. I work for the church. In the media division of the missionary department. I helped make sure that the church's commercials got to Hulu.com and helped with features of Facebook, and I also work with the I'm a Mormon campaign under the profiles. So when a member of the church wants to make a profile describing and talking about their beliefs, I make sure that it's doctrinally sound and everything like that. My question is, how do you distinguish between authorized church doctrine that's on the internet and all the rhetoric that goes on to blogs and responses like that? Do you reference like official church sources, especially with the Bott case recently, where he is a scholar of Mormon studies, where according to being at BYU, but at the same time, we had the church saying, no, that is way incorrect. So what is your?
I feel like I want to ask you that question since you're the one doing the correlating. When you get a member profile, which profiles, what's your threshold like? 'Cause it sounds like you're talking, where's the threshold? What's official and not? And I think Richard Bushman called Mormonism a theological jungle. And I think it's still true. I think so much of our content is still oral tradition driven, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of stuff circulates you hear growing up, and what's actually correlated back in the 50s is actually fairly slender. So what's your threshold for determining what's doctrinal and not?
Well, if I knew I was going to be asked that question, I would have shaved today. So
Put on a tie.
No, I'm just kidding.
I think you should come right up here.
There's a lot of leeway, and when that campaign started, the committee, we're all just part-time college students, return missionaries. A lot of the people on the team that I work with were saying don't do this, don't do that, and we were getting angry letters back from members all over the globe saying, what gives you the right to say that? Well, who are you and all this stuff. So we've been informed, to have leeway, to have people have their own voice.
Yes.
And that even if the interpretation or definitions may be slightly off from what the church may think is, the definition, there is still that individual voice that each profile has. Obviously, when there's things like, I'm a gay dad and I'm a Mormon, the church doesn't really want to see that on their official website.
There are gay dads who are Mormons.
Yes,
so why is that not an official? I think this right here, we could talk, I would like to talk to you for 2 hours and hear what's going on, because this is fascinating to me. And first of all, the heat of the responses you must get, I do not underestimate. And it indexes how important all of this is to all of us, how very cautious we are about the face we put forward, right? This is one of those 19th century underground, like we say,
and this
the best possible, every member missionary, if there's something thorny and heated, the gay dad, which is a tough subject, the gay dad, don't publicize that, but why not? See, and so I'm fascinated.
Oh, it is. I agree with you that and nowadays with the media going along with the internet and Mormon studies, it might be that we're starting to put that fear, transparency face on the internet as well. That may be part of it. Now, obviously, I'm just a college student. I don't have all the answers or anything like that. But it is just interesting with the world looking at the church, especially recently with Mitt Romney and all of the data that's available on the internet. What is what can we say as Mormons as what's officially authorized by the church and what is our responses to questions?
I think that's where branding has become really important. So we know, and again, this is a time-honored Mormon technique of managing content. If it comes with an official like LDS.org brand, we feel very comfortable with any of the material that's on that site. But if you think about we don't have a scholarly core in Mormonism, right? It's not like Catholicism where somewhere there are Jesuits patiently laboring over thorny questions and they're going to produce something very expansive and comprehensive and we're going to get to read it and know what the real answer is. It's a theological jungle out there. I mean, even Mormon doctrine, which was a, authoritative compendium, turned out to be in some respects not authoritative, this is a young tradition. We are sorting it out. And the thing that's hard, as you said, is we're doing it in the public eye. We're having our adolescence in the public eye. That's never pretty. There are absolutely no other questions. Do you just want to hear him talk more? I'd like to hear him talk more.
So, Joanna, I hear you advocating for Mormon scholars to respect, out of love and reverence for the tradition, to do their work. And I think for so many of us, we have mixed emotions, right? We're adolescents, as you point out.
In the public eye,
We
yes.
have love and respect for the tradition. At the same time, we have anger, frustration, all kinds of other emotions that come in to that. And even in scholarship, there seems to be this divide between those who can approach things mostly with love and respect and those who can approach things mostly with frustration and anger. I mean, is that kind of a false binary that we need to get rid of and say that is, we can't put those kind of boundaries on scholarship?
I think all of us who write about Mormonism for the public, whether it's, armchair and blog or people who do it for a living, there is so much emotional content to our discussions, and there's fear that we carry because the stories of Lester Bush and what happened to so-and-so and what you're not supposed to say, these filter down, right? So that fear tends to complicate and compound, the emotional baggage one brings to any scholarly project. And it takes concentration. And I think we have wonderful models. I mean, the Bush article from '73 is so carefully disciplined. He's really relying on scholarly tools to sort of piece together the most fact-based, document-based account of a very difficult subject. And in that way, there is safety in the best tools of our disciplines, just in terms of helping remind us, what responsible work looks like. And if we do responsible work, hoping that is useful work, that good will come of it. And only in that way, I think, is the fear that reverberates through this kind of work manageable. I think there was a hand here.
I'll speak loudly. Much of what's being
There are people watching online. They want to hear you.
My question is really not that important. Much of what the blogosphere concentrates on are sort of the same things over and over again with respect to polygamy or race issues or homosexuality issues and so on. I'd like to know, in light of your vast experience in this whole thing, what's the next untapped minefield that we're going to be dealing with? In terms of what is going to be the real next issue that plagues us? That
if we tell them, they'll go there. We want to keep it private.
Yeah, I saw your PowerPoint. Yeah, I know.
You listed polygamy, race,
the
LGBT issues. I think the baptisms for the dead issue is going to continue through the rest of the year. I think it's going to continue to happen. But it's so interesting. I think it's interesting to note these things go around and around and around in circles, right? And I've heard people say, well, if there were simply, that there's a hunger for a little more direction or definitive statement from an authorized source to help us stop going around in circles. That's an interesting dynamic within the community, that people continue to worry over polygamy or worry over race, that if there were that the circling might stop if there were a different kind of information from authorized sources.
Can you tell me how you view your audience? When I read you online, I sense that you're just talking to a certain audience. When I came here today, you're decidedly highbrow in terms of how you attach, yourself to these issues. How do you view your audience that you communicate with on a daily basis?
It depends on.
There's the duality thing that Bushman articulated about having to speak concurrently to two different audiences.
Exactly. I always just, like anyone who writes, I always think of my audience. So today I was in an academic venue, so I was trying to show respect for the academic study of Mormonism. But usually when I write for the public, I think about writing for my husband, who's not a member, but who is sympathetic. You know, he likes Mormons, he knows Mormons, he's married to a Mormon, and so, you know, what would fly? Or if my in-laws, you know, what would I say to my parents-in-law? You know, and so sympathetic, educated, but demanding people, exacting people, you know. Yes. Plaid shirt, yes.
So how much do you think that non-Mormon audiences are interested in really knowing the life stories of Mormons? Not just the kind of media soundbite issues, but really understanding how Mormons think and feel and how they've dealt with these things. And you may have some insight into that from your audience of readers.
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's been, not all media is friendly in general to thoughtful pieces about how everyday people live with important matters. You know, a lot of media just is ill-suited to that kind of coverage. But I think we've seen some very hopeful examples. For example, I think the Washington Post has been doing a great job. And not just through the On Faith blog, which they've generously made accessible to voices from Mormonism, but their journalistic coverage has been impressive of race, of gender. So there's hope. There's hope. I think there's a lot of space out there to be claimed if we're bold enough to tell our human stories. I really do. I think there's just so many people who don't know us, and the more voices of all kinds, of all points on the LDS spectrum that tell human stories, the better.
I have a question, and I've been raising my hand, so I'll stand
Sorry,
up for just a second.
turn this way.
One comment, one question. The first comment is the gentleman that spoke first about the Mormon.org and telling our own story. I find that very interesting that he introduced himself as saying, we're just a bunch of part-time employees who are students, but yet they are editing our words, or they are trying to give us the official voice. That scares me.
He's chuckling,
and I'm
by
not
the way.
saying that you scare me. I'm just saying that who is trying to give us that across the board equalized sounding voice. The question I have for you is this. I teach here at UVU. I teach folklore. I teach my students to understand their own culture before they begin to look at someone else's culture. But you know, my students are having a heck of a time understanding their own culture. They're hearing one thing from their mothers, one thing over the pulpit, and something else from their friends. They're being taught to fear and taught to embrace. How do we find that common ground? I read it on Feminist Mormon Housewives every morning. Where do we find someplace in between here where the pendulum says it's okay to question without being afraid?
I think that's the huge hunger that the blog vernacle has been filling, is that effort to find a community, a common ground where these very careful rules of management of what should and shouldn't be said relax just a little bit, given conditions of maybe anonymity for discussion participants, given the sort of self-selecting group identity of various blogs where you can find channels to engage in that common ground building, because depending on what ward you attend, you may not find it on Sunday. Some words, yeah, some words, no. So no, I think you're marking our big challenge, one of the big challenges right now facing our culture is how to begin in this 21st century where young people do have access to a lot of information, some of which is new for them on the internet, you know, about our history, and yet that's not discussed by people they trust at home and at church. And that's a big frontier for us all to cross. Yeah. I think there was a hand right here in purple.
Maybe one last question.
Okay, this young woman, yes, you.
Hello. Okay. I've found that there are so many either talks or pamphlets that are available online that are apparently older church documents, but that you can't find on LDS.org or anything, and lots of them are controversial, so I don't expect them to have them. But I found it's really hard to figure out if they're real, if people are just making it up to slander the church, or if it is real and the church is hiding it, or what it is. And I was wondering if you thought that even if the words weren't actually said by the general authority that they're claimed to have been said, is it almost as if just as good as if they were because people believe that they were? Or like it's almost, it becomes part of sort of the legend of Mormonism, all these beliefs. I don't know if I have a pointed question, but
No, I think you're marking again another one of the big I won't call it a problem, but it's a difficulty, a challenge that we face. Again, we have a highly correlated version that we learn at church, and there's a theological jungle out there of oral tradition we hear from grandparents and parents and older people in the tradition, and rumors, people who believe they have access to insider information on things and will make use of that in their local communities. This is a very live discursive environment. So sorting out what is good information and not is one of the challenges. And the last thing I'll say is usually more information is better. More information is better, but it takes time to process that and for communities to digest information. And especially if we've been in a highly managed relationship to our own past, there'll be a time when the information just comes out and it feels overwhelming. But I think the community will learn to work through it towards new consensuses about our own past. But that can't happen if we're hiding or holding things back or in fear of old content. So thank you very much.
So let's thank Joanna.